They thought she was just an easy target serving coffee in a rundown diner, but what they didn't know was about to change everything. Margaret Hayes wiped down the counter of May's diner for what felt like the thousandth time that evening, her hands moving in slow, deliberate circles across the worn formica surface that had seen better days 3 decades ago. The diner sat on the edge of Clayton Falls, a forgotten town where the paint peeled off buildings like old skin, and hope seemed to evaporate with every sunset. Margaret had bought this place 6 months ago, not because she needed the money or the work, but because she needed to disappear, to become invisible, to finally breathe after 23 years of living in shadows darker than most people could imagine. Her short silver hair was tucked under a faded blue bandana, and her apron was stained with grease and pie filling, the uniform of someone the world had trained itself not to see. She was 51 years old, with kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled at the regulars who shuffled in for their morning eggs and endless coffee, never knowing that those same eyes had stared down cartel bosses in Colombia, arms dealers in Eastern Europe, and terror cells across 3 continents. Margaret Hayes wasn't just any woman trying to make an honest living. She was Executive Director Margaret Hayes, the most decorated and feared federal agent in the history of the International Criminal Division, a woman who had put away more dangerous criminals than entire agencies combined. A ghost who had walked into hell more times than she could count and walked back out without a scratch. But that life was supposed to be over. That life was supposed to be buried along with the nightmares and the scars that nobody could see. She had handed in her badge, her weapon, and her clearance 6 months ago, telling herself she'd earned the right to serve pie and pour coffee without looking over her shoulder. The bell above the door chimed at 9:47 p.m., and Margaret glanced up to see 5 men walk in, their footsteps heavy and deliberate, their eyes scanning the diner like predators sizing up territory. She recognized the type immediately. The swagger, the matching leather cuts with a snake insignia on the back, the way they spread out to occupy maximum space, the casual cruelty in their smiles. The Vipers. She'd heard about them from Deputy Collins, who sometimes stopped by for lunch. A gang that had been terrorizing Clayton Falls for the past year, running drugs, extorting businesses, making life miserable for anyone who didn't bow down. The leader, a man with a shaved head and a scar running from his ear to his chin, sat down at the counter and knocked twice on the surface, loud enough to make the salt shaker jump. "Coffee," he said, not looking at her, his voice flat and entitled. Margaret poured without a word, her movement steady, her face neutral. She'd learned long ago that ego was a weapon. The more you fed it, the more dangerous it became, and the more mistakes people made. "You the owner?" the man asked, finally meeting her eyes. "I am," Margaret replied, her voice calm and measured. He smiled, showing teeth that looked like they'd been sharpened. "Name's Cutter. My associates and we've been noticing this place. Nice little setup you got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." The other 4 men laughed, a chorus of cruelty that echoed off the checkered tile floor. One of them, a younger guy with a teardrop tattoo under his left eye, walked over to the jukebox and unplugged it mid-song, the sudden silence somehow louder than the music had been. "We provide protection services in this town," Cutter continued, leaning back on his stool with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. $2,000 a month keeps your windows intact, your doors working proper, your customers safe. Real affordable when you think about what peace of mind is worth. Margaret set the coffee pot down gently, her expression unchanged. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Cutter's smile vanished like it had never existed. "I don't think you understand how this works, lady. This ain't a negotiation. This is me telling you how things are gonna be. You're new here, so I'll give you a pass this one time, but come Friday you're gonna have my money, or we're gonna have a problem. And trust me, You don't want problems with us. See how easy accidents happen? Margaret's hands remained perfectly still at her sides, her breathing even, her gaze steady. She'd been in situations like this more times than she could count, different countries, different languages, different weapons, but the same fundamental dynamic. Bullies who believed power came from fear and violence. I need you all to leave now, she said quietly. Cutter stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over her. What did you just say to me? I said leave. This is my establishment, and you're not welcome here. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The 5 men looked at each other in disbelief, then burst into laughter that sounded like breaking glass. Oh, she's got spirit, one of them said from the back. I like that. Makes it more fun. Cutter reached across the counter and grabbed Margaret's wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. Listen here, you stupid. He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion that took less than 2 seconds, Margaret twisted her arm in a way that reversed the grip, using Cutter's own momentum to slam his face into the counter hard enough to make his nose explode in a fountain of blood. Before the other 4 could process what had happened, she'd vaulted over the counter with the grace of someone half her age, her hand shooting out to strike the nearest man's throat with surgical precision, dropping him to his knees gasping for air. The one with a teardrop tattoo reached for something in his waistband, but Margaret was already there, her elbow connecting with his temple in a strike that sent him crashing into the jukebox. The 4th man managed to pull out a knife, swinging wildly, but Margaret sidestepped like she was dancing, caught his wrist, and delivered a palm strike to his elbow that bent his arm in a direction nature never intended, the knife clattering to the floor as he screamed. The 5th man, showing more intelligence than his companions, turned to run, but Margaret was faster, sweeping his legs out from under him and using his own weight to drive him face first into the floor. The entire confrontation lasted 17 seconds. Margaret stood in the center of her diner, not even breathing hard, surrounded by 5 grown men who were either unconscious, crying, or desperately trying to remember how to breathe. Margaret walked back behind the counter, picked up the phone, and dialed a number she knew by heart. Sheriff's Department, this is Deputy Collins. Hey Marcus, it's Margaret down at Mays. I've got 5 gentlemen here who need picking up. Attempted extortion, assault, destruction of property. They'll need medical attention too. Margaret, are you okay? What happened? I'm fine. Just hurry, please. And Marcus? You might want to call the FBI field office in Portland. Tell them Executive Director Hayes has a gift for them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Wait, Hayes? As in the Hayes? Margaret Hayes from the International Criminal Division. Retired, she said softly. But yes, that one. 20 minutes later, the diner was flooded with deputies and paramedics. Cutter and his gang were loaded into ambulances and squad cars, their faces still showing disbelief at what had happened. Deputy Collins, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, stood next to Margaret as she swept up the broken coffee mug. I've been coming here for 4 months, he said quietly. I had no idea. You're a legend. They tell stories about you at the academy. The woman who took down the Kozlov organization single-handedly. The agent who infiltrated the Red Scorpion cartel for 3 years. The ghost who rescued 17 hostages from that compound in Jakarta without firing a single shot. Margaret smiled sadly. Stories get exaggerated. I was just doing my job. Why here? Why this place? You could be anywhere doing anything. Because for 23 looked around her diner. The cracked vinyl booths, the flickering neon sign, the counter where lonely people came to remember they weren't alone. Years. I was someone who lived in the dark so others could live in the light. I became very good at violence, at deception, at being whoever I needed to be to get the job done. And somewhere along the way, I forgot who I actually was. I needed to find a place where I could just be. Just a woman who makes decent coffee and even better apple pie. I needed to remember that the world isn't just not the ghost or the legend or whatever else people called me Margaret. Not Agent Hayes, not Executive Director Darkness and Danger. That sometimes people are just people. Looking for a warm meal and a kind word. Collins nodded slowly. Those guys would have destroyed this town if someone didn't stop them. We tried, but they always slipped through the cracks. You did in 17 seconds what we couldn't do in a year. That's not entirely true, Margaret said gently. You were building a case, following procedure, doing things the right way. I just expedited the process. There's honor in your approach, Marcus. More honor than there was in mine sometimes. By midnight, the diner was quiet again. Margaret had declined the FBI's offer to come in for a formal debrief, promising she'd stop by the field office in a few days to give a statement. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat in her favorite booth by the window, looking out at the empty main street of Clayton Falls. She thought about all the lives she'd saved over the years, the families she'd reunited, the terrorists and criminals she'd removed from the world. She thought about the cost of that work, the relationships she'd sacrificed, the normal life she'd never had, the parts of her soul she'd traded for the greater good. She thought about the man she'd loved and lost because he couldn't compete with the job, the children she'd never had because bringing life into her world of death seemed impossibly cruel, the years of holidays spent alone in foreign countries pretending to be someone else. And she thought about tonight, about 5 bullies who'd walked into her diner expecting an easy victim and instead found something they couldn't comprehend. The truth was, she hadn't stopped being that person. The skills, the instincts, the capacity for violence when necessary, those things didn't just disappear because she'd turned in her badge. They were part of her DNA now, written into every cell, emerging automatically when threatened. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to stop being who she'd become, but to choose when and how to use those abilities. Maybe strength wasn't about domination, but about protection. Maybe power wasn't about making others afraid, but about making others safe. The bell above the door chimed, and old Tom shuffled in, a 76-year-old veteran who came in every night at 12:15 for a slice of whatever pie was left and a cup of decaf. Evening, Margaret, he said with a smile that showed more gaps than teeth. Evening, Tom. Apple or cherry tonight? Surprise me, he said, settling into his usual spot at the counter. Margaret stood up, tied her apron back on, and walked behind the counter to serve her customer, just like she'd done 100 times before. She thought about the man she'd loved and lost because he couldn't compete with the job, the children she'd never had because bringing life into her world of death seemed impossibly cruel, the years of holidays spent alone in foreign countries pretending to be someone else. Because that's who she was now, not the feared federal agent, not the legendary ghost, but a woman who chose to use her strength to protect rather than prove, to serve rather than dominate, to be present in the small moments that made up an actual life. The next morning, the story spread through Clayton Falls like wildfire. The mysterious diner owner who'd taken down the Vipers single-handedly. The decorated federal agent who'd been hiding in plain sight, serving coffee and pie while carrying secrets that could fill volumes. People started coming to May's diner in droves, not just for the food, but to see the woman who proved that strength comes in unexpected packages, that heroes don't always wear uniforms or seek recognition, that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one nobody notices. But Margaret didn't change her routine. She still opened at 6 a.m., still made the coffee strong and the portions generous, still listened to old Tom's stories about Korea and laughed at Bobby Chen's terrible jokes. And slipped extra fries to Sarah Martinez's kids when their mom was working double shifts. She'd learned something that took her 23 years and thousands of missions to understand. Real strength isn't about how many people fear you, it's about how many people feel safe because of you. Real power isn't found in domination, but in choosing mercy when you could choose violence. Real courage isn't facing danger without fear, it's showing up every day to do the small, unglamorous work of making the world slightly better, one cup of coffee at a time. The Viper's trial happened 3 months later, and Margaret attended as a witness, her testimony clinical and devastating. The organization crumbled without its leadership, and Clayton Falls began to breathe again, businesses reopening, families feeling safe to walk the streets at night, hope returning like spring after a long winter. Deputy Collins was promoted to sheriff, and he stopped by May's diner every morning, not because he had to, but because he'd found a friend in the quiet woman who poured his coffee and never made him feel small for being just a small-town cop. And Margaret? She kept serving pie and coffee, kept listening to stories, kept being present for the beautiful, ordinary moments she'd missed for so many years. Because she'd finally learned the most important lesson of all: you don't need a badge or a gun or a title to make a difference. You don't need to be feared to be respected. You don't need to prove your strength to everyone. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose to be gentle, to be kind, to be the person who makes others feel seen and valued and safe. The world will always have darkness. It will always have people who take and hurt and destroy. But it also has people who give and heal and build. And the real heroes aren't always the ones who fight the monsters in the shadows. Sometimes they're the ones who keep the lights on, who serve warm meals, who remind us that even in our darkest moments, there's still kindness, still community, still hope. Margaret Hayes learned that lesson the hard way, through years of sacrifice and service in the darkest corners of the world. But she also learned that it's never too late to choose differently, to become someone new while honoring who you've been, to use your strength not to dominate but to protect, not to take but to give. And every morning, when she unlocks the door to May's diner and turns on the lights and starts the coffee brewing, she remembers. The measure of who you are isn't found in how much power you have over others, but in how you use whatever power you have to lift others up, to make them feel valued, to remind them they matter. And that's a truth worth living for.